Goedenavond, bonsoir, good evening. It's a great pleasure and an honor to welcome you on behalf of Transitie Vlaanderen. Maar eerst iets praktisch. De avond zal in het Engels verlopen en wie graag simultaan vertaling van het Engels naar het Nederlands wenst, die kan onderaan op de wereldbol drukken en kiezen voor vertaling. Daar staat Japanees, van Engels naar Japanees, maar eigenlijk is het van Engels naar Nederlands. Mochten daar technische vragen over zijn, kan je ons daarover chatten. Pour les francophones, la soirée se passera en anglais. Malheureusement, il n'y a pas de traduction pour vous, mais très bienvenue. Already for several years, we had to wish to organize a conference with Rob Hopkins in Flanders. And Corona makes many things more difficult, but organizing this evening online was way more easier. We are happy that the founding father of the transition movement and his close colleague and coordinator of the transition network, Sarah McAdam, are our guests for tonight. This evening is made possible in cooperation with our Wallonian colleagues, Réseau Transition, with Oikos, B-Planet and Commons Lab. During these last 15 years, we saw the emergence of many citizens' transition initiatives in Flanders. And these local initiatives are committed to sustainable living, to strengthen the resilience of communities in response to the challenges and the uncertainty we face. The transition ideas inspired local and national governance and many businesses. We are clearly a society in transition, although maybe not always as fast as we would like. And we wondered, how is the transition movement doing worldwide? And how is the movement moving further? And what could be the next step for the local citizens' initiatives here in Belgium? We are eager to ask all our questions and all your questions to Rob and Sarah. And I'm very happy to hand you over in the hands of tonight's moderator, Jan Mertes, the chairman of Oikos and active in the field of sustainability for many years. Welcome, Jan.
Hi, thank you, Greet. So I hope Rob and Sarah will join us too now. Okay, as Greet said, it's really a great privilege for us and an honor to have you among us. Just two practical things before we start for the people in the audience, and I saw lots of them I know, so it's wonderful to have you all here. If you have some questions, you can use the chat and direct your questions to all panelists, and we will collect them and try to ask all of them if we have the possibility. But I suppose there will be too much of them, too much to ask. How will we work this evening? I will have a talk with Rob and Sarah. I've prepared lots of questions. This will be to just before 8:30. Then we have a break of 5 minutes. It will be a very special break with, you will see what happens. And we'll start exactly at 8:30 for the debate and the questions. So if everything's okay, we can start now. And Rob and Sarah, just join in if you want to add something to what your colleague has said. Rob, I will start with you. The idea of transition towns, transition movement, it goes back to 2006. The idea of strengthening local communities, strengthening local resilience. Can you tell us a bit more about, let's say, the social context at that time? What kind of developments or observations were decisive for the emergence of this idea?
Well, good evening, everybody, and it's really lovely to be here, and with Sarah too. I think this is going to be great. And some of you I've met, I'm sure, at different events. I always love coming to Belgium to meet with people and to Flanders. And so, yeah, I would say that takes us back to 2005, 2006, and originally, I guess the first spark came firstly from climate change. I had my kind of climate change dark night of the soul in about 2004, and then also at that time I was reading a lot about peak oil and was very kind of taken with that particular model that was very strong at the time. And I had been living in Ireland, and I moved to Totnes, and I came with this idea of what would it be like if we were able to design an intentional pathway away from oil dependency, so that by the end we ended up in a better place than where we had started from, which hadn't really been thought about very much at the time. And I came with a background of having been a permaculture teacher for a long time, so very interested in let's just do things, sort of that kind of engaged optimism kind of an approach. And I was also very taken at the time with something called contraction and convergence, which was a model that Aubrey Mayer developed, where he said the global north is up here, global south is here, the sustainable line is here. So we need to get the global north down to here so it can meet the global south. So we really designed transition as a kind of a detox for the affluent north, if you like. How do we get down that curve with a narrative that isn't about we're having to leave something, like, you know, like trying to get a child to come home after a birthday party when they've eaten too many sweets, but rather how do we feel like we're moving towards something that's irresistible? And that was really the spark of it. And how do we start where we are without needing anyone's permission? We start with where we are, what we have around us, and what we can do at that scale. And then very quickly there were people who started to be attracted to the idea, who started to bring other, what became really pivotal pieces of this. So for example, Sophie Banks and Hilary Prentice, who came and brought lots of ideas from eco-psychology, from the work of Joanna Macy, who said that actually the inner part of this journey matters just as much as your solar panels and your bicycles. You know, how we support each other, how we support communities, how we put that kind of support infrastructure in place is absolutely essential. And then there were many other people who then came and bought parts of it. And one of my favorite bits of research was done by an Italian guy called Luigi Russi, who came to Totnes and just lived here for a year and went to everything. Every transition thing you'd go to, he'd be putting out the chairs, making the tea, chatting to people. He wrote a brilliant thing called Everything Gardens. And one of the things he said in it was that as a researcher, what fascinated him most about transition wasn't the transition movement as a thing that as a researcher you can draw a circle around and say that's the transition movement. It was what he called the transition moving, how it changes and adapts. And I'm sure Sarah will come on to talk about how Transition Network has shifted its whole governance model over the last few years, using holacracy and different systems like this. You know, it's not the same as it was when it started. It keeps changing and evolving, and that's one of the things. And in the same way now, although its initial thing, motivation was peak oil and climate change, peak oil sort of rather faded as a motivation, and climate change became much more of a motivation. And then economic exclusion and social exclusion and different things have come in as drivers as it's evolved.
Okay, thank you. Sarah, were you already involved in the early days, or?
I wasn't. No. I joined in sort of 2011. But what I was going to add to what Rob says is, I think one of the fascinating things about the movement is how it evolved in different contexts. And as we saw that model that began in Totnes be taken up in Latin America, in Japan, in the States, in very many different parts of Europe, and in each place, people adapting it and finding the issues that spoke most to them and how that context changed. You know, if you look at Brazil, there's been this huge focus on water. You know, how to conserve water, how to use water well. There's been a different expectations around social justice from an early stage in Latin America. So I think for me that theme, I'm sure this is going to be a theme of this evening, of how the movement has evolved and will continue to evolve, was one of the things that attracted me in at the start, and certainly sort of my role now, quite a lot of what I'm doing is working with the international network of people who are looking at that international level of scale to see how we support what's happening locally.
Yeah, one of the central ideas of elements in the idea of transition movement is the central role of imagination. We can imagine the alternative and just start making the alternative. Does that mean that the way we organize our economy together with the ecological crisis, does it block our imagination? Does it make it more difficult for us to think of alternatives? And does it mean that the idea of transition movement is kind of an answer to feelings of despair, of powerlessness? Rob, what do you think?
Someone once referred to the transition movement as hope with its sleeves rolled up, which I really liked. So the last 3 years or something, I've been doing quite a lot of work around this question of imagination. It was a kind of a side project that I took a sabbatical to research and to do. And for me, it gave me a different lens of looking at what the transition movement does. You know, to answer your question, I feel like, yeah, the economy that we live in is what some people have called a disimagination machine. You know, it's designed to kind of co-opt and erode our imagination. We know that anxiety, trauma, stress, anxiety are all profoundly damaging to our imagination. We know that systemic racism, economic exclusion make it very hard for people to live the kind of vibrant, imaginative lives that we need. And it matters because in this time, we cannot build what we cannot imagine. And if we are creating this sort of perfect storm of conditions where the diversity of the natural world around us is contracting, where we're closing the libraries, we're driving imagination out of our education system, there's less and less space in people's lives. Imagination needs space. It's kind of disappearing out of our lives. Then it makes it all the more important, because one of the things that the transition movement does, I think, is that it helps people to create memories of the future. You know, it allows us to generate the kind of what if questions that open up the actions that we need to do. Transition initiatives on the ground give people a taste in 2021 of what the future could be like. And I think what capitalism does as well is it sells us things and allows us to imagine versions of the future that don't exist. George Monbiot, who is a writer here in the UK, gave a brilliant talk recently where he said, if you go to buy salmon in the supermarket, it has a nice picture of a fish on it and a Scottish flag, and your imagination paints a picture of a Scottish loch full of salmon running free, and actually it's produced in a horrible, intensive fish are all ill, it's full of suffering and misery, but our imagination is kind of co-opted to thinking, actually, this is really nice. So what I've seen again and again is that there are many projects that transition groups which start with a really great what if question, which unlocks all kinds of creativity and thinking. And creating those what if spaces, I think, is something that transition groups do beautifully, using open space, using different things like this, which then unlocks, if transition groups don't create those spaces, then who does? And they do it beautifully. So yeah, for me, imagination is one of the lenses to look at. We can look at transition through different lenses, look at it as being a community development tool, an economic development strategy, a kind of set of inner tools that build our resilience as communities and activists. But I think imagination is also a really good lens to look at the transition movement through.
And maybe we should keep the word stroma. I like it, actually. So it's a good word, stroma.
Imagination, we can do anything.
Sarah, does this mean that, what do you think about the idea that maybe in these difficult times with the ecological crisis, some people are afraid of imagination? Is it something that it's threatening? Is it threatening to have hope? Maybe we didn't learn to... What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's what I notice is that many of us in these times, I think all of us are feeling something around the future, about the future. Actually, I think we're feeling multiple things. And certainly part of that, I guess I can only speak for myself. I can't look inside your heart, Jan. But I know for me that part of that is fear and part of that is despair. You know, I want to be really honest and say that that for me is part of the picture right now. The sense of the scale of the change that we all see is needed can feel really overwhelming. And I think for me, that sort of fear, especially when it's kept beneath the surface, can cause us to freeze. It can overwhelm us. So there's something for me about allowing ourselves to speak about the fears and the despair, but also to speak of hope. For me, there's a difference. You know, we often speak of active hope, the concept that comes from Joanna Macy. But for me, there's something really different about a hope that is naive and that doesn't engage with what's really going on in the world, which for me is not very useful. And a different sort of hope, which again, for me, isn't about saying we are definitely going to get to this place in 20 years' time, because I have no idea about that. But I can say, I want to live in a way where I am connected to others, where I am part of the change that needs to happen, where when crisis comes, I support other people in my community and I think about how we can minimize the impact on this beautiful planet that supports us all. I want to be living in that way, regardless of where we end up, which I can't predict. But for me, these emotions are running underneath all of our work and all of our lives. And actually, one of the things that I think transition can do when we work well is allow people to express this in a way that is contained and supported by others.
Yeah, I suppose, Rob, lots of people have called you naive. What is your answer?
I don't take it as an insult. I think I don't. Yeah, I don't. I guess sometimes that's because people think the idea that anything can change is naive. And I've travelled across Europe and seen transition in so many different places that I know people can do incredible things. I've been to them, seen them. I know what they can do. I guess, to pick up on what Sarah was saying, I don't for a moment suggest that somehow this is easy, or that actually things aren't going in the wrong direction at an enormous pace, and that there is huge grief and despair that underpins that. But I feel like sometimes if we only embrace the grief and the despair, and we don't allow ourselves to imagine that actually the next 10 years could be profoundly transformative, and if we don't allow ourselves to feel into what that could be like, we feel into so often what it would be like if everything went wrong. We find it very easy to go into sort of catastrophic scenarios, and but actually, what would it be like if the next 10 years we saw the mobilizing of the most powerful people-led bottom-up movement in history? And what if that movement was actually able to achieve the aims that it sets out in 2021? And what if they were able to work together in a way that actually was able to achieve that? I feel, and that movement, of course, needs to be one which supports people and makes space for the grief and the loss and so on. But it also needs to, Martin Luther King said, movements only succeed when they paint a picture of where it is that they want to get to. And I sometimes feel like we kind of overlook that part. And if we were to start living today as if this was the early days of a new world, and we active in creating that, then how would we behave differently? And of course, we would design integral to that would be supporting each other and creating that kind of a culture. But I feel like we have to be painting pictures that we can then run towards. We have to create stars for ourselves that we can move towards.
I like that idea. Going back to the movement.
Hang on, Sarah wanted to say something.
I just wanted to pick up on this because I think it may be really interesting. I think what this conversation that Rob and I are having right now is a conversation that can so easily polarize. And for me, that's one of the things that I think we're learning as a movement and as Transition Network, the organization, is how to work with potential polarities, with tensions, in a way that isn't about saying it's this or this, but says actually what happens if it's both. And for me, I can feel even in this conversation the potential for me to react against what Rob says and think, no, I need to speak for the importance of feeling grief. And, Rob, that can push Rob more into the feeling, we need to speak about optimism. And I just want to acknowledge that I feel both those things inside me. And I know Rob feels both those things inside him. And that part of what I think we need to do collectively and individually is have those conversations that lean into the differences and find a way for both to be present.
Okay, but I'll be just in between the two of you, so nothing will happen tonight. But going back to the movement, as you said, you have it's kind of a global network of local transition groups, but this means that in this history of 15 years, there has been some kind of formalization process. You have published guides or handbooks or lists of common actions or values. What have you learned in this process of formalizing or not formalizing the movement? Maybe Sarah, you can start, or Rob, whoever wishes to start.
Well, actually, I find myself slightly distracted by a really interesting comment in the chat window, which I think speaks to this same thing. I'm reading Sergio saying you're still talking as a movement when the reality appears to be a somewhat rigid, standardized, semi-cooperative structure. So I'm interested in that because that's not my experience of the movement, but I'd love to know more about what Sergio is seeing there. I mean, for me, one of the beauties of the movement and some of the challenge of it is that it's been very loose, so and sitting as I do within Transition Network, the organization that tries to support this international movement, I have, there is almost nothing that we prescribe about what groups should be doing. And I see groups interpreting, what they think transition is. I see them interpreting in that in hugely different ways. And we certainly don't see it as our role to control that. Actually, for me, it's part of the value is that experimentation is happening in so many different parts of the movement. And the trick that I still don't think we've got completely right, but the trick for us is how we enable those experiments to talk to each other and connect up and learn from each other without it becoming rigid. And that is why we're experimenting, as Rob mentioned, we experiment in our international network with using different forms of governance where we make decisions together. We use consent decision making, and we share resources in a way where we've got them. We share them in a way that is, I think, quite sort of flexible and fluid, and we work it out together rather than feeling that any one part of the movement dictates for others. But that's my experience of it.
I feel like it's a bit of a misunderstanding to think that somehow we put out guides and books and somehow everybody rigidly does those things, and then we come along and then suggest they do something else, and then they all do that. It's actually not quite like that. So we basically created a loose set of values and principles, a very self-organizing network based on a lot of trust, and then we started telling stories about what this looked like in different places. And so the Transition Handbook, which was published in 2008, that was the first kind of printed thing, I suppose, had what we call the 12 steps of transition, because we had no idea what we were doing, and we had no idea quite what this thing was. And the 12 steps was really our attempt to say, well, it kind of, maybe you start with a bit of this, and then you do that, and then you do that. And then after a couple of years, we went back out to transition groups and said, what are you actually doing? And they would say, well, we did the first one, and then the 11th one, and then we did something completely different. Nobody was going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, very few people anyway. And then we did a book called The Transition Companion, which said, actually, it's more like going to it's more like a cookbook. You're going to need a bit of this, a sprinkle of this, some of that, and then in the essential guide, which you'll find on the Transition Network, again, it's different because we then come back and look at what everybody is doing on the ground. It's a kind of it's an evolving thing that's really based on the feedback that we get from the movement. It's much more our role is looking at what people are doing, gathering those stories, designing those stories into the training that people get. And, you know, as Sarah was saying, one of the things for me with Transition Network that is so interesting is, as a movement and as a network, is that it seeks to give power away. One of the things that Sarah was talking about, the national hubs, there are now 20 something countries that have their own national hubs, and Transition Network kind of supports those hubs to do the work initially that Transition Network did. So rather than being like us being sort of rigid control freaks who are sort of somehow holding on to the kind of operating code of transition, I feel it's much more people who are involved in transition groups on the ground design what they do. They hopefully take inspiration from the network. They will find many useful resources and tools, but they're not prescriptive. They're offered as being helpful, and then they create their own thing on the, and hopefully share the stories of what they're doing with the wider movement, which inspires other people. I think in many ways it's a network of stories, and sharing of those is one of the things that for me makes it so interesting.
I like that word, the network of stories. That's a very interesting concept. But looking back, we have 15 years of history of the transition movement. What surprised you the most in those 15 years, and what turned out to be more difficult or more unexpected than what you thought when you started? Maybe Rob, you first.
I feel like one of the things that I've loved and has been one of the greatest honors about being part of this is that it is continually surprising. And so Sarah will talk about the evaluation work that she's been part of, which was a delightful source of really interesting, surprising stories. I think the fact that it still exists is quite amazing. It's a surprise to me. Where at the beginning we were just trying to design something that might work in my town. You know, the idea that we'd see transition groups in 50 countries around the world is massively surprising. The fact that Transition Network, you know, when we started, it was the time when Occupy and things, these movements that sort of came and then went very quickly. The fact that we've been able to build a support infrastructure to support the transition movement to still be around is amazing. I think some of the things that have surprised us have been some of the changes that we've seen. So, for example, we see in a lot of places what we call the donut effect, where the energy that starts in the middle, it's very vibrant transition, drifts out to the edge with lots of businesses and projects that get started, and that sort of former energy goes out to the edge, and you get this sort of hollowing out in the middle, which is something that which has kind of been a bit of a surprise, I guess. I think seeing what we call the power to convene, how we see how transition groups are able to get people into a room together who otherwise wouldn't, and the things that can come out of that. And I think the Ceinture Alimentaire project in Liège for me is a really inspiring example of that. I think I've been surprised as well by how we tend to believe that change happens in very linear ways. You do this and then that happens and that happens, and it moves in a linear way. And the degree to which you see transition as being more like mycorrhizal culture that you introduce, and that it runs in and it under the surface quite often, and fruits in what you expect and ways you don't expect. I think when we started, we maybe also weren't thinking very kind of commercially is the wrong word, very sort of entrepreneurially about, we were still, I think, in that kind of permaculture culture of all these projects need to be run by volunteers because that's somehow morally above anything that involves any money. And I think we've kind of grown up a bit since then and recognized that if we want transition to be really inclusive, we need to be creating jobs for people. You know, I'm one of the, in my own town, we started a brewery, New Line Brewery. If you're ever in Totnes, do come and visit. And we could have started that as a community brewing project or something. We employ 10 people who can pay their mortgage and feed their kids, and that's something that's really an important part of this. If we want to kind of be building new economies, I think as well, I've been surprised by the by how difficult it is sometimes to maintain momentum on, like how much it takes out of people to do this. This is, a lot of people get involved in transition, I think, are in this for the long haul. It's not something you just pick up and do for 6 months and then put down again. So there's a kind of a stubbornness of a vision that this is going to happen. And I love to see when groups put in place really good infrastructure, kind of support infrastructure to minimize the risk of burnout in groups. And not everyone does it. You see that working well. It's really delightful. I guess the last thing I would say is I'm having started out in this movement in the time of the kind of peak oil movement, which was a sort of a forerunner, I think, of a lot of the collapsology movements that are around now, and lots of people predicting the imminent collapse of capitalism within 6 months. I think I'm also surprised at how resilient industrial capitalism is. The fact that it's sort of still there. It's like, what do you have to do to get rid of this thing? So yeah,
it may be 7 months, maybe, but
maybe 7 months.
Maybe 7 months. But I think this is a good bridge, Sarah, to the work you've been doing recently, and we've heard what your idea, your experience is. But you've been asking this question to all these local groups. You've done a big survey to get a picture, kind of in-depth analysis of the state of the transition movement. Why did you do it? Was it just because it was the 15th anniversary, or was there a more deeper existential reason why you needed to make this kind of survey?
There were deep existential reasons and there were practical reasons.
Okay.
And I think, so to go to the deeper reasons first, I think it flows from this conversation we're having. Our sense was the movement was evolving in really interesting ways in different places, but that wasn't always visible to each other. And we also had a strong sense. So we started planning this over a year ago. So before the pandemic hit, but at a time where there was, we were finding that people were asking quite big questions about exactly the questions we're exploring here today. Is the movement still relevant? They wanted to have that conversation. Is it still relevant? Where does it fit within this wider ecology of change that we're all part of? Should we be moving on to something else? What needs to shift as we have a different vision of the future that we're preparing for? So all of those questions were coming up, and we knew people were having them in their individual groups, and actually probably even more so, people talking with their friends. We knew that conversation was happening, but we were interested in how can we make that a wider sort of movement-wide conversation. And then on a sort of practical level, we also knew that we, but also hubs and groups at every level of scale, are constantly being asked for evidence about, well, what's your impact? What's your value? And it's very easy, I think, to minimize what the movement is doing. And it's also sometimes easy, I think, for us to overestimate it, And there was a feeling that we wanted to really look at, well, what evidence is there and how can we do that in a way that isn't simplistic? Because we also know that, sometimes we get asked to prove how many tons of carbon dioxide this group has saved in this, in this 6-month period with this project. And we know, and I think increasingly some of our funders know, that that isn't a helpful way of trying to think about this subject. It's something much, well, we can talk about how it's something much wider than that. So that was our feeling, was let's ask the questions that we know everyone's asking. Let's try and make those answers visible. And then, that survey that you mentioned, which was answered by people in 32 countries, and at least sort of representing nearly 400 groups. That survey, we wanted to then share the thinking from that survey, the information from that survey, and carry on a conversation across the movement. And actually, I think, for example, the event that we're having tonight, that's part of having that conversation. What I'll do, I'll just put in the chat for everybody. That's a link to our latest blog, only in English, I'm afraid, so apologies for that. But that's our blog about where we've got to with this evaluation process. It's definitely not finished. But part of what we want to do is share those results with all of you, so that you can see, well, how do I make sense of this? Because it's not just us doing the analysis. I think it's all of us that need to do the analysis.
And I must say, I've read the reports and I was quite impressed, not only by the result of the survey, but the way you analyze the results and distill it into difficult questions, themes and tensions. It's quite brave, I think, to do it that way, because it is quite existential, isn't it, Rob? The way you're dealing with material.
Yeah, well, I have to. My terrible confession of the evening is that I have spent the last month deeply involved in organising a conference called the What Next Summit, which has been completely all-consuming at the time it came out, and then took a week off to recover. So no, I haven't got around to reading it yet. Although I have been to some workshops and presentations on it, and agree with you. It was a very, very skillfully done process, and the team who created it were fantastic. And I really, really look forward to reading it very, very soon.
I like that. Sarah, to go a bit more deeper into what I read in the report, and Rob can add his views as well. At the back of the report, there is some pages with tensions, themes. First of all, you have a concept I really like, the idea of ecology of change. Maybe you can explain what this means. There are a few things I would ask you to elaborate on. First of all, there seems to be within some groups a discussion on the focus. Do we have to limit our focus, for instance, just on climate change, or do we need a more holistic approach? This struck me. The second thing is transition groups and social justice seems to be a difficult marriage. If I can say it like that, it comes back. It seems to be, a challenge. Maybe we call it like that. And third, the idea of inner transition. Maybe you can pick something. There are other elements as well. It's very interesting. I'm trying to attract people in the audience to this very interesting report. Maybe you can start, Sarah. What is your idea on those things that are mentioned in the last part of the report?
Yes, thank you, Jan. That report, there are two separate reports, and that report is the one where we're looking at relevance and potential of the movement. And as you say, I think one of the things that we felt that we should be doing is, rather than trying to leap quickly to answers, we should be trying to draw out where are the tensions and where are the differences, because often those are the places where you can find, there's an interesting conversation to have there. I mean, there's so much you just mentioned, but let me try and pinpoint just a few and really encourage people to look at the report to see some of the others. I mean, one of the themes that came up pretty strongly in the report was people saying, well, a group of people saying we need to get back to basics. We need to simplify our message, and we need to stick with a single issue. And what was interesting was that they didn't all agree on what the single issue should be. So actually the descriptions of what that should be were very, very different according to context. And for me, there's something interesting here about, I think, how easy it is to become overwhelmed with the complexity that we're, swimming in the middle of. And I was hearing from some of those groups in that sort of sense of, please, can this be made more simple? And and that's one of the things that we want to explore with people. If there's a need for simplicity and focus, what should it be? And personally, I don't think we will ever come to a conclusion on that for the whole movement. So for me, it's about how we frame this movement in a way that people are able to decide on their focus. But it's not for me to decide. Let's have the conversation. But there's also, I think there's something potentially that we're just fooling ourselves if we think that any of this can be simple, and that there's something different about having a sort of understanding of the complexity and then moving to simple next steps. So seeing the complexity doesn't mean that every group has to be acting on every issue at all times. I think there's a danger when groups try to do that they just wear themselves out and that their messaging is very muddled. But there's something for me about a movement from a zoomed out perspective to then a decision of, well, okay, and for this time, this is what our priority is going to be. And can we find activities that meet a number of needs? I mean, for me, one of the real strengths of this movement has been a willingness to look at the system rather than to think about it as an individual issue. And that often that is a little bit more straightforward if you're doing it at a local level, because at least you can see, well, okay, how does this complexity of the world show up in our place? And how can we do something in the place where we live to address it?
Okay.
I will just, if it's all right, just say something about, I mean, there's so much I could say about all of this. I'd say something about the ecology of change, because another piece for us has been wanting to understand that we are just one movement in a huge, rich tapestry of people working for change. And I think that can also help our sort of sense of overwhelm. We don't have to do all of it, but how can we be in relationship with others that are working in a way that is aligned to ours? And for me, that's one of the most interesting things for us to explore, understanding our place and understanding how we can ally with and support other struggles that have a relationship to ours. And for me, this is a piece about social justice as well, that I don't know that you necessarily address all issues of social justice by saying everybody's got to come into our movement and inviting everybody in and we will become the answer for all of this. There is something about, well, let's understand how we can put some of our energy and our attention onto the struggles that others are fighting. How can we be good allies to them in that?
Rob.
I would. Thank you, Sarah. That was great. And for me, one of the things I've always loved with the transition movement, which Sarah referred to earlier, is this ability to hold polarities and to not, because we're not a political party that has to have a policy on absolutely everything. Those discussions about to what degree are transition groups that balance between kind of activism in an Extinction Rebellion kind of a way and planting trees and doing stuff at home. People are at various places along that spectrum, different projects, and there is no right place to be. We like to hold that polarity. And when the idea that people have different reasons why they do transition, I think that's great. For me, that's part of the thing that's so great about it. And also, it's because it is a movement that has evolved so much over time, as I said earlier, and brought in new influences. It depends which publication you pick up at any one time. You'll find a different set of motivations for doing transition. And we started it saying we're doing it because of peak oil and climate change. And after a couple of years, went out to people and said, why are you doing it? And there was a great long lists of reasons why people get involved. Some people just get involved in transition because they want to meet people, or there's a project they want to start, or it's very, very different. And I think I mentioned before the What Next Summit that we just ran, and you can find all of the videos from that summit on YouTube. And in terms of that idea of the ecology of change was fundamental to that. We were trying to really bring together a wide range of different organizations to meet each other and to look at how best to work together. And part of the idea, again, with that summit was to challenge the movement with people from different social justice organizations and campaigns, from a wide range of different spaces and settings. So it's not for us to create a list of what transition is and exactly what you have to do. I think it's for us to challenge and inspire and support and create spaces where people can come together within the movement to hear new ideas and new influences. And the What Next Summit for me was a really good example of that.
Okay, we still have about 5 minutes for the last question that will be more strategic, and I think that might be a question for lots of people that were or still are active in local transition groups. How can we have the maximum of impact on what is happening in the world? And therefore, maybe I'll put it a bit provocative. Transition groups, transition movement, the model more or less formalized. Is it just a mean, or can it become a goal in itself? I think some local groups are still very active. Some have become a bit tired maybe and are looking for what shall we do. They see lots of new citizens initiatives, maybe concepts like working with commons. There's new ideas as the donut economy. And maybe I can suppose people in those local groups ask themselves, what should we do? Do we have to, as you said before, do we have to work together with others? Do we need to be the center of what is happening? Is it still useful to call ourselves a transition group? What are your ideas at this stage?
I could start, Rob. I think there's a lot in that, obviously, in that question, and I also see it relates to some of the questions that have been in the chat window. For me, I think it's important that we don't make transition an end in itself. That we're not working to sustain the movement. That's not why I'm in it. I know it's not why Rob's in it. And it feels really important to me that if the name or the the brand or the approach isn't serving people anymore, that they don't cling on to that so I do think we've always said we're not precious about the brand. We make resources available, and if people want to call themselves something different and use the resources that feel useful, fantastic. We know that I think certainly the most thriving transition groups are connected to all sorts of movements. You named a number of them: the commons movement, new economy, regenerative culture. The groups are really linking in beyond that. The last thing we want to see is transition as a silo. And I also think that from my perspective, there are still things that can feel, for me, the movement still feels pretty vibrant and dynamic. And there can be a value in having an identity that means we can connect together. And particularly this international connection for me is something that's becoming more and more powerful. And it's actually one of the things that we're working on at the moment. We're spending this year with the network of international hubs. We're spending this year reflecting together on the results of this survey, trying to identify what are the strategic interventions that we ought to be doing at an international level, and how can we do this together across different territories? And that's a process we want to make really open, so it's, you know, it can be informed by, you know, the experiences here tonight, that's all fed into the process. And we know that there are some things that we can do really well together, like doing training together, sharing skills together, sharing stories and inspiration. So for me, there is still at the moment a value in having an identity, and it's important that that doesn't become the sole purpose.
Okay, Rob.
Yeah, I would say that when we started doing transition, you know, there is an impulse that runs through people and runs through communities, which is to organize and to do something in response to the crisis that you see happening around you. And when we started, there were other things. There was permaculture, there was Agenda 21, local Agenda 21, there were like local organic gardening groups, there were vegetable box schemes. And, you know, I think one of the things that transition did was it gave a name to something that was there, which was quite disparate, and that gave an umbrella kind of name where people could say, oh, so we're doing transition, okay, and it named something that was there but kind of nebulous and didn't have an identity. And that impulse now can take many different forms, and as Sarah says, we're not precious. And we built on previous movements, and I'm sure there are other movements that will come afterwards that will build off what we do and will hopefully take the best of what we do in transition. We'll take some of those tools, we'll add in what feels more appropriate now, you know, and there's already the just transition movement we see in some places, which takes elements of transition and a much more kind of explicit social justice. For me, I feel like every few years I go on a process where I go, is transition enough? Is this enough of a thing? And what would be better than transition? And I go round, and then I think, well, maybe it would be like this, and then I speak to different people, and then I end up coming back to transition again. Not because transition is in any way perfect or in any way irreplaceable or somehow something that should be permanent, but it's something that that I feel is really kind of good at what it does, really, and as long as it's useful, then we'll know whether it's useful by doing the kind of work Sarah's done with the evaluation. If the evaluation had come back and said, actually, do you know what, it's like 2012, it's so 2012, and, you know, we're all off onto something else, then, you know, then we go off and we do something else. And other movements, like, it's this idea, we've always been clear that it's not like transition is the only thing we need. Transition is a piece of the jigsaw puzzle. And of course, we need national governments doing things and local governments doing things, and the stuff we can do as individuals. But that piece about what we can do in our neighborhoods if we mobilize and we come together and we support each other and we create infrastructures of support and investment and resourcing and whatever, I've not come across something that quite does it in the same way. And, you know, donut economics is amazing, and donut economics and transition support each other beautifully. So it's not that transition is the puzzle, it's a piece of the puzzle. And I always think sometimes when people criticize transition for not being enough like this and enough, sometimes it's a bit like criticizing a spoon for being really bad at cutting bread. You know, it's not the job it's not the tool. Transition is a tool designed to do a particular thing. Yeah. And I still think it does it really well. But if people invent it, it's all great.
Okay, thank you both for this very, very interesting talk. We'll have a pause, a break of 5 minutes. In the break, I will collect all the questions that were in the chat. I have to say something about what you're going to see. Actually, it speaks for itself. You will see during the break a wonderful presentation made by Great with, let's say, pictures of hope. If you ask yourself what transition is, you see in the pictures, we are the transition. And the wonderful idea of it, and you can see it in the picture, is that you don't have to wait for something or someone. You can start with the alternative, and often images, they speak for themselves. So you can see them during 5 minutes, and then we come back with your questions. Thanks already, and see you in 5 minutes. So we are back. First of all, thanks a lot for all the people in the audience that that gave us some ideas and questions. I think there are too many to deal with all of them, but I'll try to maybe group some of them, and I'll start with things that haven't been touched upon yet in the first part. Maybe, Sarah, start with you. Some questions have to do with what can we learn from the current and still ongoing crisis? What have we learned in recent months that is relevant for the transition movement? What do you think?
Well, it's been an interesting time, and there's a whole section in our report about responses to COVID, and actually it, I think, then links to responses to crises more generally, including sort of extreme weather events. So one of the things, there's many things we've learned. We've learned that it's obviously disrupted all sorts of activities. We've learned that I think one of the most important things we've learned is that where there were thriving transition groups, the fact that they had built networks and built sort of capacity in the community to respond to a crisis seems to have helped the response in that place. Of course, in the time of Corona, there have been mutual aid responses springing up all over the place. But I think there's some evidence, I don't want to claim too much, but there's some evidence that transition groups and their connection to other organizations in the community have really sort of helped those responses be a little bit more structured. They already know how to make good decisions. They know how to mobilize. And that feels interesting to me because we also have seen it. I mean, it was one of the things that came over very strongly from the Italian earthquake a few years back, from actually before that, the Japanese tsunami. We saw again that transition groups knew how to respond in a crisis. They could mobilize more quickly. And that for me feels like one of the interesting things that we think about for the future.
That means that you were right.
Well, maybe. It's certainly, I mean, for me, one of the things that we're exploring is how are we putting our energy into creating the change that we want to see in the world, which for me is a really important part of transition, but also how much are we preparing ourselves to be resilient to the change that is coming, whether we like it or not, and to be resilient in a way that stops us, that when crisis happens, it helps us to move in healthy directions. And I saw there was a comment in the chat about initially there seemed to be a good community response to Corona, but as the crisis lengthened, there was more fragmentation that people saw. And for me, I think transition does have some really good skills and tools. It's not alone in this, about supporting communities to come together. And one of the things, for example, that they did in Italy after the earthquake was they created space not just for practical responses, which were really important, but also for a process of the community grieving what they had lost, that they needed to do that first, and then to start to imagine what now was possible in their town as a result of the disruption. And I think there was some, that for me, that's one of the things. Those are the sort of tools that we need to learn and share across our movement.
Okay, Rob, a question for you. We know now that capitalism will be over in 7 months, but in the meantime, how do you speak with, let's say, the enemy? For instance, it was called in chat people who are in favor of strong economic growth, for instance, the symbol of capitalism. How do you speak with them? Can you convince them of what you're saying, or is it not worth the discussion and the debate? How do you do that?
I think also the question was also framed in terms of climate change, and we do have people who are skeptical about climate change. I've learned over the years that there's not that much to be gained by trying to convince somebody who's skeptical about climate change. You know, we all have a limited amount of energy and a limited amount of time. We also need to give times to our families and our partners and our family and our community, and so we have a certain amount of hours in our week that we can dedicate to transition. Is that time best spent trying to convince somebody who doesn't believe in climate change that they're wrong, or is it best spent trying to support the people who are already passionate about trying to do something, do that thing as inspiringly and as effectively and as impactfully as possible? You know, there are times when that can be a good thing to do, I guess. But I've tried over the years, and you know, as somebody who is on social media, sometimes I end up being drawn into conversation. I've never convinced anybody that climate change is real. We didn't believe it was a total waste of time. And in the, you know, in the same way, you know, economic growth, you know, I've always, whenever I've been invited to participate in kind of political debates where it's going to be you talk about transition against somebody from the Economic Institute and someone from the British Industry Forum or something, I never do those things because they just polarize and they're just divisive, and there's often not much learned from them. And I think people learn much more from spaces where people are like the podcast that I do, for example, from What If to What Next, rather than debating whether something is a good idea. Actually, what we do is create a space where we say, okay, let's imagine it's 10 years in the future and that thing already exists. What would it be like? What would it be like to live in a city where there's been a universal basic income for 8 years? How would life be different? What would the daily life be like? Those explorations I find so much more useful than is this a good idea? Is it not a good idea? Kind of polarization. And I think that what we've seen, one of the big shifts we've seen since the transition movement started, is that in opinion polls now, something like 85% of people are saying climate change is an urgent problem and we need to act on it. That was not the case in 2006. That was not the case in 2000. The idea, very often doors that we feel might be put closed to us actually swing open very, very easily. And there's a big sense of urgency that we need to do things. And a lot of people in all kinds of different positions looking for creative responses. And the transition movement has that in lorry loads. So I don't feel that there's any point in debating things. We just get on with supporting people who want to make change. Sarah?
Oh, yes, Sarah.
I just wanted to come in there because I completely agree with what Rob was saying, and also I think we see so many institutions now with a sense that they need to do something, but still thinking that their response needs to be very siloed. You know, how are we going to reduce carbon emissions, and with the concept that they will be able to do that by the mayor's office or the regional government developing a plan and then implementing this plan in the territory that they're responsible for. And I think they also know that that's not going to work. I was interested in the question about how do we convince people who don't see the urgency. My experience these days is that people really feel the urgency and they don't see how they can handle it, so they move away from it. And I see that at a political level, you know, institutions just feeling overwhelmed. I do think there's something that transition and others, you know, we work closely with Donut Economics on this, can do about supporting municipalities to have a more systemic approach where they bring their citizens in and together design what are the shifts that need to happen in infrastructure, in the economy, the local economy, in food, in all the different things that are possible, because there is no way that they can make those shifts happen from one office. And just as an example, so we have this project called the Municipalities in Transition Project, because we were asked for a practical example. Those are pilots that are happening all over the world, a number of them in Europe, of really direct collaboration between the municipality and a group of transitioners to look systemically across their neighborhood and agree what changes are needed. And what we're finding with that, it's really early days and it's difficult, but what we're finding is that the plans often start quite small, and that actually the experience of collaboration excites people and they start to get more ambitious. And we've seen, you know, I think always of a place in Hungary that started with a plan of how could they reduce the use of plastic cups at their community events. And I remember thinking, well, that's great, but is that really going to make any difference to the world? And, you know, within a few months, that same group was starting to talk about how can we make sure that all the food for all our schools in this area is grown locally and is organic and sustainable. And that, you know, for me, it's those shifts that feel exciting.
Yeah. Rob, two specific questions, but I think one you have answered already was a question about basic income, but from your answer I learned that you're in favor of it. Maybe that's enough, but another question about the 7 months we have with capitalism in the context of riding the tiger. What about private funding for transition projects? Are you for or against it?
Private funding, how do you mean?
That was the question, I think.
Private funding sounds great. Can we? Yeah, we'd love some. So universal basic income, I feel like is one of the great transformative ideas of our time. And Sarah talked about COVID and the impacts of COVID. You know, I think one of the things that COVID has shown us many things. One of them, it has killed many of the myths, I think, that were in place, stopping really focused action on the climate and ecological emergency. You know, we know now that actually businesses can completely repurpose in a very short period of time, that breweries can start making hand sanitizer in a matter of weeks, that companies can start making PPE in a very short period of time. We know that the idea that there's no money for change is just ridiculous. If there's an urgency to do something, you can find the money. We know that people will step up. We know, you know, we've seen so many of the arguments that were put in place to stop action on climate change were just nonsense. And here in the UK, it seemed like at every turn we could have had a universal basic income or done something else, and we've done something else every time. Well, we'll give you money off going to the restaurant, or we'll give you money to take time off work, or, you know, in effect, we've kind of had a universal basic income with what's called the furlough scheme in the UK, where people who aren't able to work are getting support, although it's uneven and it's not socially just. So I feel like a universal basic income is absolutely the idea that has come of age, because it as much as from the perspective around imagination we were talking early on, it takes away that anxiety, that precariousness that is so destructive. It gives people space in their life to think, what do I want to do? Maybe I want to do something else. It would lead to a flowering of creativity, of entrepreneurship, it's one of those liberating ideas. And Rutger Bregman's book about universal basic income is brilliant, I think, in that regard. In terms of who we would take money off, I think, you know, transition groups, I think quite often people spend a bit too much time worrying about it. I remember the Centre for Alternative Technology in Wales spent about 4 years designing a policy as to whether they would take money off oil companies and so on, and decided they wouldn't, and then realized a few years later that they'd never been offered any money by oil companies before or since, and it was never really a question. I guess what inspires me a lot in transition is when projects invite their community to invest. So I mentioned the Centre Élémentaire in Liège. They raised £5 million of investment from local people to fund that project. And I think if private money wants to go in, or if support, as long as it doesn't, as long as private companies don't somehow greenwash themselves off the back of it, you know, this is really, really urgent, and we have a tiny little window of time to do incredibly ambitious things, and we have no resource to do it. So we need to bring the resource in, but the place I always start is with the community around.
Yeah. Okay, Sarah, I will have one question for you, and then I'll ask you both to give your final thoughts, the things you would like to say. there were some remarks or questions on the idea of despair, hopelessness. You spoke about it already in the first part. Fear, is it something within the transition groups that we don't talk about enough? Is it kind of a taboo? Is it too difficult? Or do you have the experience that we are starting to talk about it and to empower one another in all these emotions? What do you think?
I think it varies from group to group. My experience is that those groups that really try to integrate inner change and outer change tend to be the ones that are strongest. And for me, this is one of the questions that we're really interested in exploring, is how to get that integration of the emotional responses and the practical actions, and a respect for both, because often groups themselves can polarize, and certainly we see polarization across the movement of people who say, no, we've got to just keep doing, or we've got to only be optimistic, and then people who will say, but I need to express the sort of grief, and I need to have we need to be allowing space for reflection, or there will be no deep change. So for me, there's something about how do we listen to each other and bring both those things together. And I think there are now some really great practices which allow space for reflection and for people to, my personal experience is that when I am given space and I give myself space to express grief and rage, because I have a lot of rage for how the system is and where the impacts are felt in this system, and for the destruction that is being caused, and also for my part in it, because I'm not separate from this system that is causing this huge pain. When I'm allowed to express that, and I allow myself to express that, I can then move through that and find joy and a determination to act. But if I keep it squashed down, it overwhelms me.
Yeah. Rob, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I think in terms of the question, I think for me, it's one of the things that has always been most fascinating about the transition movement and transition network as an organization, actually, has been that grief and rage and despair is not suppressed down, and the tools and the space that we make in meetings for exploring that, the use of tools like Joanna Macy's work, and anyone who's done transition training will know that it's really central to that. And I always say, I think if you don't experience grief and rage almost on a daily basis, you're not paying attention. It's like it's the absolutely natural response. It's the people who aren't feeling grief and rage and despair that I worry about. I know for me, one of the things in my own work, whether in Transition Network or in Transition Town.net, of being in that very intense, charged place, of being in the center of a process like this, with a mixture of carrying that grief and carrying the despair and carrying people's expectation and sense of hope as well. They kind of look to the transition movement for hope and for solutions with this. Is that movements like transition and many transition groups, things I was involved in before, we lost so many people in those movements through burnout, and some of the strategies and approaches put in place in transition and the resources that are around burnout made a huge difference. And in my town, one of the things that has been really important to me has been that our local group, there were lots of psychologists and therapists and counselors who were very supportive of transition, who offered their support free of charge to anyone working at the center of transition. And I know for me, at times when it felt really, really overwhelming, that made such an enormous difference. It felt like such a precious thing that was available to us. and it's certainly made a big difference to me, and I'm sure it does for many people. So yeah, I certainly don't see transition. I see some other movements where it does feel like the pain and the despair and the rage is not talked about, and it's the elephant in the corner. And I don't see that in the transition movement. But as Sarah says, it very much varies from group to group, because some groups have a really strong inner culture and they really value that, and some other transition groups are very like, we're going to do this, and and they don't. And I feel like that to their detriment, that they don't incorporate that into what they do.
Okay, we're coming near the end of this webinar. It went by at an enormous speed, but it was very interesting. I will ask you both your final thoughts before I give back the floor to Greet for closing remarks. Sarah, are there things you would like to say after this webinar, things that struck you or things you didn't have the chance to say, whatever?
I suppose the main thing is that it's a conversation that needs to continue. One of the things that I mentioned that we're trying to work with the hubs, the international network of hubs, to look at, well, what are the strategic interventions that feel most useful at this time? And there's something for me about we want to keep sharing those ideas out to the movement through mechanisms like this, through the blogs, and hear your responses and your feedback. I think one of the things that feels one of the things I've enjoyed about tonight and feels important is that we keep asking the questions, that the questions are as important as the answers. And I've really seen that in the chat window, and there's lots of questions there that I'm going to save the chat and take them away and feed them into our evaluation process, because for me this is rich information. And one of the things we are exploring is how we could create more opportunities for connection at that international scale that is open to all. And there's so much fantastic technology that's available now that makes it much more possible to do that than would have been the case even a couple of years ago. So that I watch this space for more information about that. And I really encourage people to bring all their questions and all their challenge into that process, because it's really useful.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Rob?
Yeah, I would just, like Sarah says, that I think conversations like this are really important, and I've really enjoyed this evening. So thank you to organisers and for inviting us this evening. I guess for me, I would like to say thank you to everybody who's listening to this call, who's involved in transition. And I visit so many places where people are doing transition, and I see all these great projects people are doing, and everybody, everywhere I go, always says, but it's too small and it's not enough. And and it's like, well, yeah, on the one hand, yeah, that is true. And on the other hand, I always say to people, we never know the impact of the stories that we create and where they go and who they touch and what they inspire. And I always like to tell a story of when I went to Berlin, to Kreuzberg in Berlin, where the transition group there had spent 2 years trying to get permission from their municipality to plant fruit trees in the park. And they all said, there's no point, they'll all get vandalized. It's a really tough neighborhood. The trees won't last. And they persisted and they planted the trees. And 5 years later, they were big trees in this park. And about a year after they planted them, their municipality changed their policy to say that as a municipality, every plant that we will plant will be an edible species. It became the policy all across the region. Everything they did would be edible plants. And I always say to people, like, where did that change come from? It came from the moment those people sat around the table and said, so should we plant the trees then? Let's plant the trees. And that moment when with other people, we say, okay, are we going to do it? Let's do it. There's such potential in that moment. It's the thing. That's the thing that gets me out of bed every morning is seeing, when I see that moment when people say, shall we? Okay. And sometimes it might just be a little project. Sometimes it'll be a huge thing, like in Liège, or like the big community energy projects that come through transition, or the really big ambitious things. Sometimes I see it when I visit a place where there's a project being driven by the municipality or the mayor's office, that they've been inspired by something they saw in transition and now they're creating. You know, we have no idea where change goes. Recently, I heard the mayor of Paris giving her a speech about Paris as a 15-minute city. It could have been written by the transition movement, and I know she's been very inspired by the transition movement. So I would just say to people, firstly, thank you for what you do. Secondly, you know, share your stories with the international movement. As I said before, this is a movement, and we need your stories. And thirdly, just try to hold that thought that the things that you start can go off in all kinds of directions, and it's the moment that spark, that let's do it spark, which has so much potential in it, I think.
Okay, thank you. Sarah, you wanted the last word, or you were... No. Okay, then I will thank you both. It was wonderful talking with you. Very, very interesting. I hope and I think that people, many people in the audience really liked it and thought it was inspiring. So thanks, many thanks. And I will give the floor back to Greet for the closing remarks.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Sarah, Jan, for this interesting and honest conversation. I hope it inspired you at home. Thank you all for joining us tonight. There were many of you, 213 to be exact. And we will send you the replay of this evening and some more information tomorrow by email. Also the information that was shared in the chat by Rob and Sarah. So I also want to thank our partners and the people that were involved behind the screen of the webinar. And thanks to Waar for the use of their webinar studio. And for now, the chat will remain open for a while. You can now chat to both attendees and participants, what means that you can chat to everyone and everyone can see what you write. And further, I wish you all a beautiful evening and hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.